¿Comenzamos? ¿Estamos listos? Hola a todas, a todos los que están conectados ya para la sesión de hoy. Mi nombre es Valeria Campos, estoy aquí en reemplazo de Fernanda Medina, que debiese estar en mi lugar presentando al profesor Pinkard. Sin embargo, ella tuvo una pequeña contingencia, así que aparezco yo en su lugar. Sin embargo, no soy yo la importante, por supuesto, sino el profesor que hoy día nos acompaña, que es el profesor Pinkard, a quien voy a presentar inmediatamente. Terry Pinkard es actualmente profesor en la Oficina del Presidente de la Universidad de Georgetown desde 2005. Había estado antes enseñando en Georgetown, pero entre medio también fue profesor de la Northwestern University desde el 2000 al 2005. También ha sido co-líder del Seminario de Innovación Moral entre el 2014 y el 2015. Y además investigador principal en el Instituto de Ética Kennedy de Georgetown del 81 al 2000, ¿no? Su área de especialización, por supuesto, son los fundamentos del idealismo trascendental alemán, desde Kant, pasando por Hegel e incluso Husserl. Su tesis doctoral también aborda el pensamiento de Husserl. Y bueno, su enseñanza y su investigación desde entonces se centra en explorar la tradición alemana en la filosofía desde Kant al presente. Tiene numerosas publicaciones, entre las que se incluyen los textos Hegel's Naturalism, Mind, Nature and the Final Ends of Life, del 2012, después German Philosophy, 1760s to 1860s, The Legacy of Idealism, del 2002, también la biografía de Hegel, a Biography, del 2000, también Democratic Liberalism and Social Union, de 1987, y bueno, numerosos artículos de revista y capítulos de libro. Voy a saludar al profesor Pinkard. Hello, professor. In the name of the Sociedad de Estudios Hegelianos, the Society of Hegelian Studies here in Chile, we salute you and we thank you for being here with us, for sharing your knowledge with us and with the public that's going to be connected to this lecture. And we're very thankful for your presence.
Thank you very much for having me here. So shall we begin, or?
Just a second, because I'm going to give the title of your presentation, which is parágrafos 556, 563, el arte como forma del espíritu absoluto, lo discursivo, lo no discursivo, lo religioso y lo político. El profesor va a dar su conferencia en inglés. Sin embargo, tenemos, como ustedes pueden ya ver aquí, el artículo o la presentación del profesor Pinkard traducido al castellano, que va a ser pasada mientras él habla, traducida por Fernanda Medina, una excelente traducción. Así que, Professor Pinkard, we're ready. When you want, you can start. We are all set down.
Okay, well, very good. Well, thank you very much for having me today, and I hope that this is of some help to us. Let me begin by giving a kind of very brief overview of the first part of the paper, and then I will proceed to go ahead and go back to where the paper, just reading the paper, where it really begins. But basically, one of the things that puzzled me, that I really realized it hasn't been treated very much, in fact, hardly at all in the literature on Hegel, is the gap between what Hegel writes about art in his books and the huge amount of stuff that has been written on Hegel's philosophy of art, including all the volumes and volumes of lectures on the philosophy of art by Hegel. The encyclopedia, which is the only place that we have that has Hegel's actual writings on the philosophy of art, are very thin. It's just a couple of pages. If that's all that we had by Hegel, if we did not have, for example, all the lectures and all the student notes about the philosophy of art that he'd given, we'd have really no idea what Hegel was talking about. There's also a very peculiar kind of, you might say, development, or a very interesting development that goes on in Hegel's philosophy of art. In 1807, when Hegel really becomes Hegel here, when he finishes and publishes the Phenomenology of Spirit, there is no section in that book called the philosophy of art here. Instead, there's something called the art religion. This is sometimes translated as the religion of art, but it's Kunstreligion. It is a form of religion that is an aesthetic form, that is a philosophy of art in itself here. We know that when he wrote in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy in 1817, that's 10 years later after the Phenomenology, when he gets to the section on absolute spirit, the section is divided into three. It's called the art religion, the revealed religion, i.e. Christianity, and philosophy. When he redoes the encyclopedia in 1827 and 1830, we finally get the canonical form where it's now art, religion, and philosophy. So art doesn't actually appear as a separate category in Hegel's writings officially until 1827. Now, actually, we know that he was giving courses in Heidelberg in 1817 and 1818 on the philosophy of art, but we have no idea what he was saying because we have no student lecture notes, and we have none of his lecture notes from that period here. We do know that when he began lecturing in 1820 in Berlin, that the structure of the philosophy of art had the kind of typical Hegelian structure to it about symbolic art and romantic art and so on here. So he had clearly changed his mind. In 1807, there was no separate philosophy of art. Art was treated as the aesthetic religion of the Greeks. That was over, and then there was nothing more to say about it. In 1817, that was still the case when he published his encyclopedia. In 1820, he had now adopted a much different kind of view. So what's going on there? So what I want to do is I want to look at the text very carefully. I also want to look a little bit at the background of what Hegel was doing to try and figure out what might be motivating him to driving him to do this. And then I also want to ask more general questions about what type of philosophical importance this has both for Hegel and also for us in this case. Now, one of the most important backgrounds of this is that Hegel publishes the Phenomenology in 1807. But then, as we know, in 1812 and then later in rounding up in 1815, Napoleon, whom Hegel thinks is really carrying the French Revolution forward and making it, really actual in the modern world. Napoleon's campaign in Russia is a disaster. He loses his army. He falls from power. He's exiled. And there's a Congress meeting in Vienna in 1815 that's going to decide about the structure of Europe and what it's going to look like after the fall of Napoleon. This, as we know from Hegel's letters, was very worrisome for him. He had really staked his philosophy on the idea that it was a philosophy of modernity, and that modernity was marked by the French Revolution. And that in 1815, the Congress of Vienna was determined to turn the clock back, obliterate the French Revolution, restore Europe to exactly where it had been prior to the revolution, and so on. And in fact, they failed to do that. Although the Bourbons were returned to the throne and so on, most of the kinds of reforms and so on that Napoleon and the French Revolution put into effect were now really written into law. So in fact, Hegel was relieved by this, but this also meant that he really had to rethink now a large part of what the modern world would be like. Now, up until 1817, he really seemed to think that the only interesting art that had occurred was Greek art. That all art after that really had no role to play in absolute spirit here. After 1820, he decided that there really had to be a form of modern art. And so the question was, what could art do, right? What could art do for us in the modern world that it hadn't before here? What role, if any, can art play in the new modern world? And he called this, using the terminology of his own day, he called it romantic art here. It's an art of interiority, an art of inwardness, and so on here. We do know that in the 1820s, by 1826, in fact, was the first time we see this. In 1826, Hegel announces in his lectures that art is a thing of the past, that it no longer fits man's highest vocation here. A lot of the debate around Hegel since then about art has gone on really about that, whether Hegel was portending the end of art or whether Hegel was simply saying that art was now going to play a different role in modernity here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead now and finally turn to section 2 from the phenomenology to the encyclopedia, religion and art. That's on page 4 of the English edition here. So if we want to, go up in this here from the antecedents, right, to number 2 from the phenomenology to the encyclopedia, we'll go on here. Okay.
Excuse me, Professor, is at the end of this first?
Yes, go ahead. At the end of this, yes, it'll be about 4 pages.
Al final, dice que al final de aquí.
Go, okay.
Aquí, from phenomenology to encyclopedia. Here?
Yes, here we are.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so one of the things that was on Hegel's mind when he sketched out the initial paragraphs, right, for the religion of art in the 1817 encyclopedia was the status of religion in his system. By the time he had moved on to giving art its own separate category in absolute spirit in 1827 and 1830, here, his worries about religion had become even more pronounced. In the later editions, in the last section on, for example, objective spirit, he launched into a larger discussion of the role of religion in the life of Geist, spirit, mind, and in particular on the role of religion in the state. So this is before you even get to absolute spirit, which is about religion. You've already got this long discussion there here. In the system, the idea is that in ascending to the level of different peoples, different peoples in the progression of the philosophy of history, and that ascent goes, remember, from one is free to some are free to all are free here. We, the readers, are also now moving in the direction of looking at spirit itself, rather than any particular actualization of the concept, rather than the way it's instantiated in any particular, say, people or state or political unit and so on here. That is, we're thinking about the status of humanity in general, rather than about the way in which particular formations of humanity play their role in world history. The reflection on spirit, on what it means to be spirit, is just what absolute spirit is supposed to indicate. More colloquially, absolute spirit is humanity's reflection on what it is to be the spiritual-minded creature that it is. Now, Hegel's worries here were both systematic and bound to his own time here. I've already mentioned this paragraph here. On the one hand, he was concerned with elaborating the relation between art and religion, concerned with the role that any art could play in the development of a fully modern social and political order, in which Hegel was, of course, determined that it was going to be philosophy that was going to play the basic leading role here. These were coming to a head in the years between finishing the phenomenology and assuming his position first in Heidelberg in 1816, and then finally until the end of his life in Berlin from 1818 to 1831. The paragraph here that we have here is what we've already mentioned. It's the way in which Napoleon has been defeated, and Hegel has now tried to rethink the role of art in light of the Congress of Vienna and so on. And in the phenomenology, we want to know what in the encyclopedia, he calls this chapter on art, he says, really just a transitional phase. Now, this goes back to something that goes on in the phenomenology of spirit here. In the phenomenology, the section right before the long chapter on religion, where you have the religion of art and so on introduced, concerns the confession and forgiveness of two beautiful souls who have become what he calls the acting and the judging consciousness. Each of them is the actualization of a kind of Kantian and Fichtean conception of self-consciousness, in which the true motives of a moral agent must, by metaphysical necessity, be invisible in the social world. This is, I think, crucial here. Kant had argued that a genuinely virtuous action had to be carried out in light of an act of freedom, acting according to duty here, of freedom that itself required a form of causality that could have no appearance as it was in the phenomenal world. There could be no empirical test, and this not even an introspective test, that could determine whether the cause of the action was a freely willed choice or was it merely some arbitrary inclination. So there's a sense we're invisible to each other, but we're also invisible to ourselves here. And Hegel thought that this led to a kind of very ferocious and detached moralism here. He dramatized that into a story about the breakdown of this kind of moralism that follows in practice once such a conception has been adopted. It concerns two agents, each of which is obsessed with the purity of their motives and their own unconditional freedom. basically, one agent says, I only act from the purest of motives, and I never act until I have all the salient, all the important facts available to me. When I have all the important facts that I could have known, then I act. And therefore, even if I end up doing something wrong because I didn't get all the facts, nonetheless, I'm completely pure in my motive. I did everything that I could do. The other says, I never act until I have all the salient, important facts. But I never have all the salient, important facts, and neither do you. And thus, I never act. I only judge. So I condemn all those who do act because they're acting without having all the facts that they need in front of them here, and so on. Each accuses the other, therefore, of deception, lying, hypocrisy, here, and so on. And each vehemently rejects the imputation that the other accuser could have the standing to know his motives here. So each is accusing the other of lying, being a hypocrite, and so on. And each is answering that saying, actually, I'm not the hypocrite. You're the hypocrite here, because I know the purity of my motives, and I know whether or not I have all the facts or not before me in order to act here. It's only when they come to see the irrationality of this view that each shifts instead to confessing to his own stiff-necked stance and forgiving the other for the harsh accusations that were made. And there's this kind of reconciliation that's staged. Now, much has been written about this, but one of the things that I think Hegel is doing, about 700 pages into the phenomenology, is he's making good on the problem he had originally introduced in the earlier chapter on self-consciousness in the phenomenology here, about the way in which demands for and struggles for recognition from another agent collapse into the irrationality of relations of mastery and servitude. In that picture, two self-conscious agents confront each other. In being self-conscious, each knows what he or she is doing when they act, and each is capable of redeeming their acts by an appeal to reasons. They can say why they're doing this. Now, there are each moments of a social whole. Each is an I, which is also a we. This is textually disputed, but I think if you look at the text, you have the introduction of self-consciousness in the third chapter of the phenomenology, and then you immediately go over to the idea of life. You have the self-conscious life. So that's the unity. That falls apart into different people, right, who are now addressing each other and so on. And just as we can imagine that each speaks the same language as the other, so that the whole, take that here, the language here, is given concrete form in the express speech acts of both of them. Each also, therefore, claims to have a kind of immediate knowledge of what counts as the appropriate exhibition or manifestation of the language. Each claims, that is, notice, an immediate, non-inferential, non-empirical knowledge of what it is, say, to be a speaker of that language in a way that's different from more external ways of identifying oneself as a we, such as, for example, noting that you might say if you're standing in line, everybody in line is carrying an umbrella. And you say, well, we're all, how interesting, we're all carrying umbrellas here. No, actually, when you're speaking a language, you know what it is that you're saying in this case. And you know that non-empirically, non-inferentially. You don't have to make an inference, nor do you have to go look for evidence to figure out what it is that you are saying here. In the example of speaking a language here, we have each therefore claims an authority to speak for the whole, similar to, for example, when one says, we English speakers say, and each does so with what Hegel calls self-certainty here. That's when one says, we English speakers would never say that. You can see this if I insisted, for example, I don't really speak Spanish, right? But if I insisted that one of you was speaking Spanish the wrong way, you'd have to say, well no, we're native speakers. We know without having to consult anything else that that is not what this particular sentence means or this word means, and so on here. Whenever there's a dispute about whether some act corresponds to this collective authority, there's therefore a dispute about the so-called self-certainty over who speaks for the whole. And when one of the agents is willing to stake his life on possessing that authority, the relation spirals downward into a struggle for recognition that ends with one of them compelling the other to submit to his authority, with the result that out of their original unity comes disunity. And out of shared meanings comes an inegalitarian, unjust relation. Such a compelled form of recognition is, of course, deeply irrational. The master must demand recognition from somebody whom he denies has the authority to bestow it, since if he had the authority to bestow it, he would also have the authority to withhold it. As he wrote that in the Phenomenology, Hegel thought that the resolution of that contradiction would lay in recognizing the rule of reason as that which binds the two together, and of submitting all such inegalitarian claims to reason's tribunal, where in fact they would fail. And you look at the chapters, it's consciousness, self-consciousness, reason here. As he wrote the book, however, he changed his mind about the feasibility of doing that the way he originally intended. And he added the chapter on spirit and religion to the book. Again, this is a matter of some dispute here. Hegel starts out thinking that he's going to write a book with only about 3 or 4 chapters. He ends up writing a book with all these other chapters. All the other chapters are longer than the original part of the book. And in many ways, part of the trick of reading the Phenomenology is to read Hegel's dissatisfaction with what he's doing as he's doing it, so that he's now going to end up writing a different book than he had set out to write originally. And as he brought the book to its penultimate stage in the discussion of beautiful souls, several hundred pages later, he made good on the idea that the dead end reached in the section on mastery and servitude was to be transcended by appeal to the idea that in a fully individualistic, even moralistic society, the impasse reached by the beautiful souls could be resolved by acts of confession and forgiveness in which each intuits, Hegel's own word, himself in the other. There's an Anschauung. You're seeing yourself in the other. You are intuiting yourself. Now, again, the analogy of shared language as the we throws some light on this. Just as one does not, say, normally infer the meanings of the words of the shared language here, as if one heard this is red, one inferred to he probably means this is red. But the two beautiful souls immediately see in their own distorted self-certainty that they are doing the same thing. And that it is, what they're doing is senseless. The medium in which they make their accusations against each other is that of language, which, as Hegel says at that particular point in the Phenomenology, language is, he says, the existence, the Dasein of spirit. It's the actuality of spirit. Language is a practice which shows itself in the particular utterances of its speakers, and which is real, wirklich, actual, only in its being manifested by the speakers. As a practice, language has no actuality beyond its practitioners, and the practitioners are practitioners only in manifesting that language. That is, again, in this particular section, Hegel is moving away from, you might say, a kind of view that still is very prevalent in ordinary thought and in philosophy, that whenever you're confronted with one of these kinds of issues of one or the other, you want to see which one is primary, which one produces the other, or whether they're both producing each other. And Hegel says the model of production there is the wrong model. The correct model is that of manifestation. When you speak a language, you manifest your knowledge of that language in the way in which you pick it up. And the language shows itself in the acts of its speakers, and the speakers manifest the language in their particular act. The setting for the encounter between the beautiful souls is that of Hegel's own day. The kind of self-reflexiveness that he thought had come to be the necessary form of self-conscious modernity seemed to find its expression in an attractive but ultimately senseless conception of freedom that made us all invisible to each other and invisible to ourselves. However, both the ideas of the full invisibility of the inner life, as well as those of the full visibility of the inner life, are each as one-sided as the other, and are as one-sided as the idea that we are all either independent, autonomous individuals, or otherwise empty placeholders for anonymous social forces. The modern form of life, the spirit of modernity, is reflected in the self-certainty of the individuals who are exhibiting it, manifesting it in their language and actions, as well as in the way in which the form of life is itself showing itself or manifesting itself in them. Hegel ends the section on beautiful souls in the moment of reconciliation, in which he says, maybe a bit puzzlingly, this is now a quote from Hegel, the reconciling yes, in which both eyes, both egos, eyes let go of their opposed existence, is the existence of the I extended into two-ness, Zweiheit, which therein remains the same as itself. Two-ness is the same as itself, which has the certainty of itself and its complete self-relinquishing, and in its opposite. And then he says, it is the God that appears, der erscheinende Gott, the God that appears in the midst of those who know themselves as pure knowing. This means that at this stage in the development of the phenomenology's account, one of the basic problems, you might say maybe even the basic problem of the whole book, which has to do with the status of self-conscious subjectivity, has been resolved, but only in a non-discursive way. Each non-discursively intuits himself in the other. After the completion of his logic, this issue of the role, if any, of non-discursive thought had become even more critical for Hegel, since the logic is so clearly an argument for the absolute status of discursive, judgmental, and inferential thought. This was, Hegel thought, the role religion had to play. Originally, it was non-discursive. And Hegel came to see sometime around 1817 that one of the biggest issues concerned the role that art was to play in the modern world, and in the philosophy of Geist in general, and what this had to do with the phenomenology's odd quasi-resolution of the struggle over recognition and the confession and forgiveness and reconciliation and the joint non-discursive intuition of each and the other. Okay, 3, art is absolute spirit. The passage from objective spirit to absolute spirit has to do with the way in which practical reason is embedded in the institutions and practices of ethical life. Sittlichkeit. Ethical life is the way it has now been rendered in English. Probably moral ethos would be a better translation, but for right now we'll stick with ethical life. This requires a move that focuses not just on doing the right thing, but on understanding why doing the right thing would even matter at all. The basic distinction between Moralität, morality, and ethical life, Sittlichkeit, moral ethos, is that between the relations between and among subjects being conceived along the lines of monadic subjects relating to each other is mediated by a system of moral rules. It's very much the morality system, very much the system in Kant's mind. And that in which the subjects are not conceived monadically, but rather as essentially involved in relations, in the relations of itself, let's say, of love and friendship, or in the case of the state, of citizenship here. This is, I think, again, a crucial thing for Hegel. In the Kantian system, morality is always concerned as a system of rules, so that my relation to another person is mediated by this system of rules up there. And then we imagine Kant says a kind of, cosmic referee who blows a whistle every now and then, and, calls you offside when you've done something wrong and so on. And this is much different from a non-rule-based kind of system of ethics, such as we find in love and friendship in the family, and then in citizenship and justice in the state here. Religion, in this early view, though, religion forms the basic ethical bond among the people of a political community, in that it non-discursively provides the motivation and principles of a life that actually has a grip on the people involved. As Hegel tells his story, religion begins as the non-discursive grasp among the people of a given community about what it is that holds them together, about what ultimately matters here. And as such, it is as much immediate knowledge as is the knowledge of the shared language. As religion develops, it becomes gradually more and more discursive, especially among the people of the book, among which, of course, Hegel assigned special importance to Christianity. In its further development, religion as the religion of the book, Christianity, develops out of itself a theology, which by submitting the claims of religion to reflective rational inquiry, necessarily transforms itself into philosophy, the Wissenschaft, the science of pure reason itself. And thus, and that's telling the story, the Christian form of life transforms itself into a more philosophically inclined form of life, The non-discursive gradually becomes more discursive, and then finally becomes, in philosophy, fully discursive. In Hegel's original formulation of the phenomenology, the introduction of religion showed how the inherently dyadic, and thus not monadic, structure of two agents engaged in recognition, confession, forgiveness is made real, in which Hegel's dense phrase about der erscheinende Gott, the appearing God, is made, stages its entrance. As he moves to the religion of art, he is concerned to show that the religion and ethical life of the ancient Greeks was united in this experience of beauty. Hegel accepted what he took to be Herodotus' claim, that it was the poets, in particular Hesiod, who gave the Greek their gods, although in light of later philology that claim is rather dubious, but never mind. Since on that view, the Greek gods were essentially aesthetic creations. Attending to them tied the Greeks together into essentially an aesthetic unity, but that was a unity that was fated to fall apart on its own terms. The phenomenology's account, as is still the case in the 1817 encyclopedia, thus argues that the deficiencies of a purely aesthetic conception of ethical life carry within themselves a logical push to develop the more discursive account that finally culminates in absolute knowing, in which the possibility of art serving any kind of ethical function or political function is over. By the time he began to lecture on the subject, he had developed a way of marking that division, which also appears in the 1830s encyclopedia. Art, religion, and philosophy are now ordered, notice, interestingly, in terms of the fully non-discursive, art, a mixture moving towards the discursive, religion, developing scripture, which then developing a theology, and then the fully discursive, philosophy. Or as Hegel expresses it actually in the encyclopedia there, he expresses it as intuition, Anschauung, right? Again, the intuition of each and the other that you have in the phenomenology, the purely non-discursive. Intuition, representation, Vorstellung, and then thought, Denken. In terms of the 1830 encyclopedia, art is the way in which an element of sensibility is transformed into a sign, Zeichen, a sign of the idea. In Hegel's terminology, the idea, is what he calls the unity of concept and reality, or sometimes concept and objectivity. In the terms I've interpreted him here, the idea is thus the term for the unity of a practice and its practitioners. Here, that is the way in which a general practice, such as language, shows itself, zeigt sich, as Hegel even says so, shows itself in the actions of the practitioners, in speech acts, who in turn exhibit the practice in their actions. Hegel's philosophical account is thus not that practice is producing the practitioners, as I say sometimes in the post-strugglist later said, it's language that speaks in us, not we who speak a language here. It shows itself in the actions of the practitioners, who in turn exhibit the practice in their actions here. It's not practices producing practitioners, nor practitioners producing the practice. Here, that's what you get in, for example, all contractarian or conventionalist accounts that are so popular in Anglophone philosophy. Nor even that of the co-production of practice and practitioner. That would be what he calls in his logic Wechselwirkung here, right, and so on, a kind of reciprocal action. The final stage of essence, which is inappropriate for the accounts of agency that are framed in the teleological terms of concept. The way that Hegel sets up his account of art, therefore, has to do with its ethical and political role. After the breakdown of the political work of art, the Greek state, and the art religion of ancient Greece, art would seem to have no more essential role to play. As he was rethinking this after 1817, this obviously was for him a fundamental problem. So art, he says, thus fundamentally presents an intuition of the, and this is a quote from Hegel, the so-called unity of nature and spirit, in which the truth of spirit emerges only after the breakdown of the more intuitive, immediate form. That is, in which the truth of spirit in that context is that its meanings are not in fact products of nature to be explained in terms of the categories of force, ground, and consequence, okay, for which the moderns are the paradigms. I'm still, again, quoting here from the philosophy of art here and so on. In its most immediate form, in this self-certainty, now quote, burdened with immediacy, the freedom of the subject is only a customary ethic, noisita, without the infinite reflection into itself, without the subjective inwardness of conscience. End quote. In the cases where the particular sensuous content is itself in its particularity a sign of the idea, Hegel's words, as might be the case, for example, with, say, a piece of sculpture that expressed the way in which a god might look. That would be a sign of the idea. One has the aesthetic phenomenon of beauty, which itself only has a weak connection to the experience of natural beauty, which has more to do with certain inbuilt dispositions and the like, or dispositions to appreciate symmetrical things and so on. An individual work of art is thereby like an individual action in that it now manifests the general practice in the way it exemplifies the practice, as when one shows somebody, for example, say, how to do a dance step, or how to do a dance step with finesse. This is how it's done, says the dance teacher making a move. Notice, this is not a discursive judgment, it's a non-discursive. It's, look at me, now do it this way here. The individual work of art is likewise a moralist version of this is what it is to be a minded creature, maybe even a god, with all its ramifications in this context. The work of art thus condenses a set of complex meanings into one sign of the idea, unlike a discursive judgment, which breaks them all up and then recombines them. Since the basic determination of human agency is freedom, the true work of art would be a sign of freedom, a kind of individual sign of this is what it's like, or this is what it means to be free, but in a condensed and non-discursive, intuitive manner. Discursively, we'd say that freedom is acting without there having to be one element in the agent as the ruler or another element as the ruled in one's action. And if one is a Hegelian, to add that one is acting in terms of a shared set of meanings with another so that each can, like the two beautiful souls, confessing and forgiving to each other, understand the unity of self and other, or even more concretely, acting in terms, say, of love or friendship, acting in terms of justice as constituting the virtues of citizenship. That would be Hegelian freedom, discursively put. Following some of the usage of his day, Hegel called this the ideal of art. An individual work that shows, but does not necessarily discursively say, what it is to be a free agent. If it has to make itself discursive to do so, it ceases to be art. And Hegel thinks this is one of the problems with contemporary literature, is that contemporary literature is becoming more and more philosophical. As it becomes more philosophical, it becomes more discursive. As it becomes more discursive, it really ceases at that point to be art and just becomes philosophy. Part 4, the history of the arts, historicity of the arts. In the lecture series from 1820 onward, Hegel made it clear that, quote, since the history of religions coincides with world history, here again, that's a quote from Hegel, the progress of art in history could itself be divided into 3 stages. In its earliest stage, art is at one with religious self-consciousness. But neither art nor religious self-consciousness could, at that stage, have developed any distinct theological understanding of divinity. Instead, all of the energy for art and religion will be absorbed into art itself. The need for art, as he calls it, would in those cases exist, since art, quote, would be the only organ which the abstract, in itself unclear and confused content here, which is taken out from natural and spiritual elements, can strive to bring itself to consciousness, end quote. He decided to call this symbolic art and put just about every form of art prior to the Greeks, and for the most part, all of non-Western art, that's just a prejudice on his part, into that category. This is art that does not yet determinately know what it wants to say, and not knowing that, it can have no real sense of what would count as the best way to say it, except to craft a work of beauty and just point to it. Art and religion at that point would have only the vaguest sense of what, outside of the conditions of natural beauty, symmetry, harmony, and the like, could count as an adequate expression. However, in the encyclopedia, the historical ordering of the progress from symbolic, pre-Greek, to classical, Greek, to romantic art, which is all art after the triumph of Christianity, is only implicit, unlike in the lecture series from 1820 onward. On the whole, the encyclopedia treats the three as three simple possibilities for art as a mode of absolute spirit, whereas the lecture series treats them as each flourishing in specific historical periods. So one of the questions that one would ask oneself is, which one really is Hegel? Right? Because he has two different ways of doing it. One is just to see them each as different modes. The other is to see them as existing in a kind of historical progression. Interestingly, he calls the most direct form of art the art of sublimity, not of beauty. Sublimity points beyond itself to something like the infinite, which cannot be aesthetically grasped here. And at these earlier forms of collective self-formation, cannot be adequately conceptualized in any form. In the art of the sublime, the sign in effect says that what it is to be a minded, geisty creature is this, the inexpressible. That's what symbolic art, the art of sublimity. Symbolic art can thus have no particular direction to itself. Symbolic art can't get better at what it's doing here, since all attempts to express the inexpressible all fail for the same obvious reason. And there can be no progress in symbolic art other than in technique and materials. There can be progress in that, but there's no progress in what art is doing as art for symbolic art here. Therefore, the failures of symbolic art cannot be written off as indication of lack, say, of skill or aptitude on the artist's part. Its failures are instead expressions of deeper conceptual impasses, not so much in art as in a certain kind of religion, and thus in a certain kind of way of living. The sublime is not the beautiful. It's the other to human life, which sets human life apart by showing its insignificance in relation to the sublime, and thereby also spurring reflection on what might be of redeeming value in human life, and which otherwise seems so insignificant in comparison with the infinite. The gods of religion and the arts of sublimity inspire awe, but cannot reconcile people and gods. On the other hand, beauty, which occurs at a later stage of collective self-formation, will be the sign of spirit comprehending itself, in which the collectivity takes itself to have perfectly expressed itself. In such art, there's a standard of progress inherent to it, since there can be better and worse ways of presenting what Hegel calls humanity's highest vocation. It's Bestimmung here, it's destiny. Humanity's highest vocation in beautiful form, for the reason that only the most beautiful form will be adequate to that highest vocation. A less beautiful presentation of the God will be inferior to a more beautiful presentation, since the latter would in fact be a more truthful presentation. In giving this account, Hegel seems to follow in the wake of Kant's conception of natural beauty as the spontaneous harmonization of intellect, the understanding, der Verstand, and imagination, in which the prosaic world we grasp discursively in the intellect spontaneously harmonizes with the world as we might imagine it in the imagination. Since the intellect is guided by concepts, which are rules for the synthesis of representations, and the imagination has no rules, spontaneous harmony of rule-guided and non-rule-guided faculties can itself have no rules. The Greek world is like that, or at least so Hegel thought, at least the very archaic Greek world. And if the gods and men function together, and when everybody fulfilled the requirements of their place in the whole, the result was a spontaneous harmonization, and therefore a work of beauty, a political work of beauty here. He later referred to the ancient Greek political life as the political work of art. In Hegel's presentation, when the archaic Greeks thought about what the world meant as a whole, they thought it through in aesthetic terms, by way of statues, poems, pictures, and music, and not in discursive terms. However, that form of life was fated to break down as the contradictions which were only implicit in the aesthetic fusion of singular lives and the world as a whole began themselves to be aesthetically presented to the Greek audience paradigmatically in tragedies such as Antigone. Those contradictions appearing in tragic plays pushed the Greeks into a more discursive philosophical mode, which was incompatible with the absolute claims made by their earlier aesthetic mode. And as that happened, the older classical art began to be displaced. The older Greek temples, once the beautiful houses of the gods, became merely beautiful buildings. items in the future to be copied and imitated, perhaps, for their beauty, but not for their truth about the relation between gods and peoples. For the Greeks, the whole constituted by people, gods, and earth supposedly had an aesthetic unity, and as that aesthetic unity began to unravel, so did the unity. When the unity fully came apart, so did the religion and the form of life oriented around it. Rather than returning back to a religion of sublimity, the Mediterranean world, in this case in Roman form, pushed onward to a non-aesthetic unity based on more prosaic matters such as the power of the Roman army and legions, here coupled with Romans' often deft and pragmatic diplomacy in dealing with its conquered peoples. The non-aesthetic unity of empire replaced the aesthetic unity of the political work of art and expanded its scope. There were many reasons to be a Roman: wealth, power, peace, protection, so on. But they were not immanent, not internal to the self-certainty of the people, the various conquered peoples that it ruled. With Christianity, a new spiritual unity was established, so Hegel thought, that purported to fill in the gaps left by Roman imperial unity, but also not in any necessarily beautiful way. With that, art also necessarily had to change. When it came to portraying the divine or humanity's highest interests, romantic art, the art following in the wake of the widespread acceptance of Christianity, quote, gives up portraying it as such in an external shape, and thus of showing it by means of beauty. It exhibits the divine as only condescending to appearance. It shows the divine as an intimacy, Innigkeit, in externality, end of quote. Hegel's changing reflections on the topic emerged gradually in the lecture series. In 1820, keeping with his earlier assessment of the phenomenology, an 1817 encyclopedia, he told his students that our relationship to art indeed no longer has the high seriousness and significance it once had, end of quote. That's 1820. In 1823, he was saying, quote, the work of art cannot fulfill our final absolute need. We no longer worship an artwork, and our relationship to the artwork is of a more reflectively circumspect sort. That's 1823. In 1826, he's saying the highest vocation for art is a thing of the past. Quote, leaving open the idea that art might still have a role to play in modern life. By 1828, Hegel had sharpened his view to the claim that, quote, we no longer bend the knee to God the Father, that's the Enlightenment God, or Pallas Athena, no matter how excellently they may be presented here. And putting it even more strongly, he claimed, the bounds of art do not lie in art, but lie in us. And, quote, our time is described as the period now after art, nach der Kunst. Part 5, Art, Religion, Politics, Absorption, and the Non-Absorptive. In his earlier days, first in Tübingen with Schelling and Hölderlin, and then later at Frankfurt with Hölderlin, and then even later in Jena with Schelling once again, Hegel was consumed with the issue about the relation between art and philosophy. By the writing of the Phenomenology, however, Hegel had firmly come down against the idea that the truth about Geist was in its highest form an aesthetic, non-discursive matter. His friend Schelling, of course, held the opposite here. Philosophy is the science of reason, triumphed over the non-discursive intuition of the absolute that Schelling had defended in his early work, especially the system of transcendental idealism of 1800. But at least by the beginning of his stay in Berlin in 1818, Hegel had become convinced that there also had to be a place for modern art in the world after the Congress of Vienna had not reversed the basic gains of the revolution. By the lectures of 1820, this is very significant, he thought he had found this in Italian and Dutch painting. He'd also managed to see Italian and Dutch painting by that time, where, quote, the magic of seeming to be, the magic of shine and shinin here, so perfected by Dutch painters, indicated the place of art in a world in which a certain kind of self-distancing reflection was more of a basis for shared life and religion rather than the more immediate absorption that he thought the ancient Greek cults had practiced. This magic of seeming to be was, as it were, he called it the music of painting. And it was this absorption in what is reflectively taken as seeming to be, that is, an absorption in an almost paradigmatically non-absorptive state, that the power of modern art was to lie. Now, what was most striking about the art religion of the Greeks was its Lebendigkeit, its liveliness. the way in which the Greeks are both self-conscious and absorbed in the religious cults. At first, Hegel, like a lot of people, thought that this new form of modernity, self-consciousness, prevented this kind of absorption. We were now forever to be alienated from all these different practices. At first, Hegel suspected the liveliness of art just had to go missing in modern art. But after his discovery after 1818 of the way in which to understand the absorption and the non-absorptive, reflective act on absorptive action and thought, it's all those Hegelian reflections piled on top of each other, as captured in Dutch genre painting or still life, Hegel did more or less a complete about-face. By the 1828 lectures, you can see, trace this development here, he seemed to have found a place for modern art as a mode of collective and personal self-reflection. The absorption of non-absorptive reflection on the ordinary objects of life enables a kind of intimacy, this Innigkeit, with the world that is a result of an activity which Hegel, adopting a term that he got from Luther, he calls it a Vereinigung, a kind of making oneself intimate with the object, an active losing oneself in the world as one lets the world, as it were, roll over at oneself. It's a sich ergehen, as Hegel calls it. All this moved by the character of freedom and intimacy. The discussions of Vereinigung doesn't appear in the 1827 and 1830 versions of the encyclopedia, interestingly. Instead, the discussion of art is still framed on both sides, both the beginning of the discussion and the end of the discussion, by religion and the political and social role of religion in art. This is very striking that this is the way Hegel would both begin and end the discussion of art in the encyclopedia, the last version of the encyclopedia. In the transition and run-up to this discussion of art, section 552, Hegel speaks in the concluding section on states and world history and about how the social and political community can only be held together by a Sitte, an ethos, and that this ethos must be internal to the religious consciousness of the people. Hegel says, the state rests on ethical dispositions, and these rest on religious dispositions. And therefore, if the religion is not true, the ethical dispositions will also be false. What he called the monstrous era of our times, quote unquote, consists in thinking that the ethical bond of the political community can be severed from the religious bond, even though clearly the two are to be analytically distinguished. Hegel notes that, quote, there cannot be two kinds of conscience, one religious and another ethical, which is distinct from it in substance and content, end quote, and that it is simply useless to organize the state along ethical lines if the religious disposition of the people are at odds with it. He uses those thoughts to launch, strangely, to launch into a rather fevered attack on Catholicism. He had long had an anti-Catholic edge to him. He was, after all, brought up as a Württemberg Protestant. But even he had been taken aback at the ferocity of the church's reaction to the revolution in 1789, and even more so at the full-throated attempt to undo the revolution and wipe out its memory after Napoleon's defeat. He ridiculed as simply a farce the French Charter, not a constitution chosen for the French after 1814 that reinstated the Catholic Church as the established religion, kept intact almost all of the revolutionary Napoleonic reforms, such as the Napoleonic Code of Law, yet pretended as if nothing had really happened and that Louis XVIII had been ruling since 1789. Although the regime had the external trappings of a constitutional monarchy, the kind that Hegel defended, had the trappings, it was really an absolute monarchy, since virtually all the limits to the king's authority could be lifted at any time by the king himself. Hegel blamed this state of affairs on the Catholic Church and its authoritarian structure, distorting the religious consciousness of the people. He was in turn shocked and disturbed by the French Revolution of 1830, which swept away, right? And he was swept all that away and was disturbed for no other reason than it seemed to show that the whole of the church wasn't as rigid as Hegel had said it was here. It was also becoming a bit more clear to him during the 1820s that the Russian Protestant church was, well, not that much better, at all. This next to last discussion of art in the encyclopedia therefore have to do with how the philosophy of religion needs to see how the moral ethos, the Sittlichkeit of a people, coheres with its principles of its laws. What is stressed in the lectures and plays an implicit role in the encyclopedia is, as we noted, the political role that art played in ancient Greek life and how that's impossible for modern life. Modern art, even though it's a central role to play in freeing people in the otherwise alienating prosaic modern world, as he called it, is very secondary to religion. Religion held things together for the Greeks, and so he seems to be saying it has to do it for the moderns. Art did that for the Greeks, but it cannot do that for the moderns. Hegel's own political philosophy laid out the baselines of this new order as resting on the systematic combination of the Lockean rights to life, liberty, and property, the post-Christian moral scheme of treating people with dignity and acting only in terms of reasons about which one could exercise one's own insight, a moral ethos or Sittlichkeit of the bourgeois family, a civil society with a market embedded in it, and a constitutional monarchy topping the whole thing off. None of this will work unless, so he thought, a kind of enlightened, heavily reinterpreted Protestant form of Christianity became the new moral ethos. However, as the 1820s wore on, Hegel seemed to become more pessimistic about that possibility, although he never abandoned his faith in the power of reason to force progress along. The conclusion which Hegel did not want to draw from his own thought will be that, in fact, and against his own theory, Protestant Christianity failed to hold things together. Then the future might well just be an unending cycle of a search for absolute freedom, followed by chaos and Jacobin terror, then followed by revanchist restoration, leading to reformist politics, which then falls apart into chaos following the demand for absolute freedom ad infinitum. If he had lived to see the promise followed by the collapse of 1848, he probably would have been even more pessimistic. A large strand of contemporary Hegel scholarship tends to elevate his later philosophy of art and his philosophy in terms of its secular nature, and to ignore or denigrate the religious dimension. In the Encyclopedia, Hegel gives little place to art but a lot to religion. In the lectures based on the Encyclopedia, however, he went much further in developing a philosophy of modern art as having secular importance distinct from that of religion. Behind that always his attempt to make his own philosophy into his own time's grasp in thought, as he called it in the Philosophy of Right. However, his own time was at odds with himself, and so it seems some of the strains with those times also appear in Hegel's own thought, as we watch him working his way out through the philosophy of art and the philosophy of religion and his political philosophy in this period in the 1820s, as he's trying to put it all together and changing his mind about a whole bunch of things. But that concludes that. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I hope that was of some help, and we can go over to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Pinkard. Very interesting lecture. I would like myself to make a question, but first we're going to see if people have any questions. Bueno, le agradezco al profesor Pinkard. Entonces ahora abrimos un espacio para las preguntas de ustedes, los auditoras que quieran hacer. No sé si quizás aparecen cosas que yo no veo, ¿no? Las pueden poner en inglés directamente, yo se las puedo leer al profesor Pinkard, o las pueden poner en castellano y puedo intentar una traducción semisimultánea para el profesor Pinkard. Aquí tenemos una de Marcus Dollar. Professor, I'm going to read this question to you. It's from Marcus Dollar. It says, what is the role of subjectivity with regard to the absolute? If the absolute is internally connected to a form of Innerlichkeit, and Innerlichkeit is a radical transformation of subjectivity in art and in religion.
Okay.
Did I read it correctly?
Yeah, the question is very clear
correctly.
I think. Well, look, this is,
okay.
I mean, first of all, it's a very good question because it really goes to the core, absolute basis of what Hegel is about here. You might think, one way, you might think the absolute is a thing. It stands over on one side, and we, subjective individuals, stand over on the other side, and the question is how you put them together here. That would certainly be the way Hegel would say that, say, Verstand, the intellect would think of this here, the understanding. Reason, however, is a different way of understanding this. That is, Verstand, which is the kind of intellect that we find in the natural sciences, is forever looking at individual things producing other individual things. We're forever looking for, say, causal connections, as Hegel called it in the section about force, consequence, and power here. And thus we might think that there is an absolute thing out there, and then we come along and we're trying to connect with the absolute thing. Well, in Hegel's view, that's the wrong way to think about it. That is, the absolute is going to be the structure of reason itself. And that has no Wirklichkeit, no reality, no actuality, unless it is manifested in the practices of these creatures with subjectivity. These creatures capable of subjectivity, capable of having not merely consciousness, but self-consciousness here. So the inwardness that we have in this case, right, is in fact an inwardness that is already, on Hegel's view, permeated with the absolute, is the way the absolute shows itself to us. And then we manifest how we take what has been shown to us, right, through our various actions. Again, that the analogy is going to be there with the way you speak a language and so on. There is no such thing as the English language or the Spanish language unless there are English speakers and Spanish speakers here. It's not as if there was a form of Spanish waiting out there in the cosmos, and then we happen to come along and connect with it as if it were a separate thing from us. It is us, but of course it's not just the sum total of all of us. It actually is a unity on its own. There are right and wrong ways to speak Spanish here, and we manifest that. It also historically develops. And the same thing is going to be true now of the absolute. That is, the absolute is also in the process of development, since we, who are the creatures that manifest the absolute, are also ourselves in the process of development here. Now, one of the real issues here is there a way that the absolute really, really is, and we are only getting closer and closer and closer to manifesting it correctly? You might think of that on the analogy with whether or not there is such a thing as an ideal language, that, say, English, Spanish, Chinese are non-ideal, and maybe what we need is something like the Vienna Circle had proposed in the 1930s. We need an ideal language, a perfect language that doesn't have all the oddities and contingencies of the language that we actually speak. That's a mistake. The absolute, we are not getting closer to an already finished absolute. We are the way in which the absolute comes to a full consciousness of itself. Now, in a word, what is that? That's, as it were, we are the way in which reason comes to a consciousness of itself. So Hegel has this kind of view that this is ultimately a kind of structure of the cosmos and so on. And when we're thinking rationally, we're just thinking about what it is to be. And what it is to be, this is an Aristotelian idea, is to be intelligible. It's to make sense. And making sense has a history to itself. Now, let me go back, Marcus, and just ask you if did that answer your question, or did that answer a question that you didn't ask? Was that the answer to another question, but not the one that you raised?
Well, see if Marcus, what he answers. I'm gonna translate just a little bit the question and your answer very quickly and synthetic. I don't know if I understand it absolutely so. Pero Marcus estaba preguntando sobre el rol de la subjetividad en relación con lo absoluto, ¿no? Y el profesor quiere dejar en claro que lo absoluto, como estructura de la razón en general, no hay que pensarlo como separado, ¿no es cierto?, a la subjetividad, en la medida en que el espíritu, lo absoluto no tiene actualidad o efectividad, a menos que se manifieste en las prácticas de los individuos con subjetividad, es decir, con autoconciencia. El absoluto entonces se manifiesta en sus acciones, ¿no? Y por eso él trató el tema del lenguaje, ¿no? Análogo al lenguaje en su función pragmática, digamos, a cómo se usa el lenguaje. Entonces no estaría separado el lenguaje y el absoluto, sino que, y tampoco existiría esta idea de que el absoluto es algo así como un momento ideal al cual el lenguaje humano, caído, contingente, tendría que acercarse progresivamente, sino que hay una suerte de de desenvolvimiento conjunto, por decirlo así, o habría que pensar eso, digamos, de una manera conjunta, coimplicada. Para decirlo de manera sintética, espero que haya podido interpretar al profesor bien. Professor, we have another question. Is that okay with you? Can I continue with questions?
Yes, yes.
Okay. We have, well, Marcus says this is very helpful. We're going now with Christian Palox. He says, religion, art, and philosophy seem to work as borrowing, not, isn't it?
It seems to work as
Borrowing, not? I don't know what that means, really.
Borrowing. Don't know what that means either. So
B-O-R-R-O-M-E-A-N. Borrowing. Not. It's between quotes.
Ask Christian what borrowing is.
Well, I thought maybe that you will know what that means. I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, okay, so here Christian is explaining a little better. Religion, art, and philosophy for Hegel work as a borrowing knot, isn't it? This same system, he explains more, no? And he says now, this same system works in his syllogisms between spirit, nature, and logic. Do you think we could compare these two ways of thinking in threes, and is this what Heidegger called ontology?
Okay. Well, ontology is, again, Hegel doesn't actually call this an ontology. He calls it.
He says ontotheology. Sorry, I read it.
Okay, yes.
What Heidegger called ontotheology.
Yeah, okay. Let me go to the question of ontotheology first here. Is this what Heidegger calls an ontotheology? Heidegger had the answer is no, it's not ontotheology. But why not? Heidegger had a view that the history of metaphysics, the history of Western culture really, was the idea of looking for the meaning of being, Sinn von Sein, in terms of which among the many entities, Seienden, here, was the most real. And that roughly the history of Western metaphysics is a history that begins, you might say, with Plato thinking that the good was the most real being. That this was replaced with the Christian God as the most real being. That Kant replaced that with the transcendental subject as the most real being. And that Hegel replaced this with Geist as the most real being here. And that Nietzsche thought it was the will to power, and he was therefore the last metaphysician, and so on here. And this was all, Heidegger didn't say it was much a mistake. It was a particular way of seeing things. It was only one-sided. We don't have to do it this way, and so on. And he said that all the Western metaphysics is really ontotheology, because it's all looking basically for the role that God played. You always want to find the absolute is what produces everything. The absolute produces everything. Everything depends on the absolute. The absolute only depends on itself. Right? Causa sui, as Spinoza would put it. Now, Hegel doesn't think that. That is, this view that Heidegger attributes to him is not Hegel's view. Hegel is not looking to see which entity is more real than another in this case. Now, one of the ways Heidegger makes that interpretation of Hegel in Sein und Zeit, being in time, in the chapter on Hegel, he begins by quoting a text from Hegel, where he says, Der Geist fällt in die Zeit. Spirit falls into time. Now, he says, this shows that Hegel thinks that Geist exists apart from time, right? Much like God, and that somehow it does something, it falls into time here. And that shows that Hegel really is an ontotheological thinker. Okay, now there's one particularly big problem with that interpretation, and that is that Hegel never said that. Heidegger was using the text that had been edited by Georg Lausanne, Lasson just was a theologian. Lasson just inserted that into the text. There is nothing in the manuscripts that Lasson had that has that statement in it. Such that the later edition of that same text that was done by Johannes Hofmeister in the 1930s took that sentence out because it was never supposed to be there in the first place. So the very basis that Heidegger uses, right, to accuse Hegel of ontotheology is already corrupt. Now, I mean, I suppose Heidegger didn't really care about that, or he didn't know it. Certainly didn't know it at the time. He didn't realize he was dealing with a corrupt text here. So first, the way that the very basis of the Heideggerian interpretation of Hegel rests on something that Hegel never said. And I think actually it's the case that Hegel never would say that, because Geist couldn't exist outside of time. Geist, in fact, is temporal. And that's why the analogy that I have given you of think of the relation between the absolute and subjectivity as like that between language and a speaker is in fact the right way to think about it, because you're not saying that language is more real than the speaker or it produces the speaker, nor are you saying that the speaker is more real than the language or it produces the language. It is a different logic. Again, in Hegel's logic, it's the logic of the concept. The idea that one produces the other is what Hegel calls logic of essence. The logic of essence can only show itself. It can't say anything about itself. It collapses into it. It falls apart at the very end of the logic of essence into its own kind of mess and becomes the logic of the concept and so on. So that's the idea. Now, Hegel does proceed in terms of threes, but that's because Hegel thinks that there are universals, particulars, and individuals here, and that in any logical discursive form, one has to be able to distinguish those. And then the question is, what is the relation now between universals, particulars, and individuals? And what is the logic of talking about them? And so Hegel has a strong view of this, that all our theory of judgment and syllogism and so on turn on how we see the mediations among these very basic logical concepts here. Logic is the form of the world. It's the form of the world, and we are part of the world, and logic is the logic of generalities, particularities, and individualities. Does that help?
I think that was very helpful. I'm sure Christian Pollux will appreciate it. I'm just going to make a very quick translation, okay, especially on what you say on Heidegger. Very interesting, Professor. Thank you for that. Bueno, estaba preguntando sobre la relación de Hegel con la ontoteología, si este sistema, digamos, ¿cómo se dirá?, terciario o trinitario que existe entre el espíritu, la naturaleza y la lógica podía caer bajo eso que Heidegger llama ontoteología. El profesor dice que Heidegger comete un error en su referencia a Heidegger en Ser y Tiempo, a Hegel en Ser y Tiempo, al interpretar una frase que en una primera edición de alguien llamado Lausanne, no lo conozco, no sé si lo pronuncié bien, sería errónea, ¿no?, que después es removida en una segunda edición editada por Hofmeister. Esta sentencia dice algo así como que el espíritu cae en el tiempo, lo que supondría que el espíritu entonces es trascendente al mundo, trascendente al tiempo, y por lo tanto emparentaría el pensamiento de Hegel con el de la ontoteología. Sin embargo, el profesor dice que eso no está en Hegel y que Heidegger de alguna manera sobreinterpretó sobre una edición que no corresponde al pensamiento de Hegel, y él invita entonces a leer a Hegel desde una lógica, por decirlo así, que no reproduce esta relación derivativa, ¿no? Derivative relation. There is no derivative relation in logic, in Hegelian logic, right? There is no like a first meaning and then something that comes from it, analogically, if you want, or derivatively. No hay derivación, sino que hay una suerte de implicación entre generalidades, particularidades y singularidades, sin que exista anteroposterioridad. Entonces eso habría que sacar a Hegel de esta tradición ontoteológica, ¿no? Is that okay if I make you another question, Professor? You tell me if you're okay with it. We have more questions. We can chat a little more if you want, or if
why not?
Is that fine with you? Okay. So another question. Bruno Leon, in his lesson on aesthetics of 1826, Hegel affirms that the contents of art, religion, and philosophy are the same, but they are different in form. So they are different expressions of the concept. With that in view, and taking the rejection of thinking Hegelian philosophy as a teleology, how we understand what is proposed on the lessons.
Can you say the last part over again, given the...
Okay, within that in view and taking the rejection of thinking Hegelian philosophy as a teleology, how we understand what is proposed on the lessons.
On the lesson. Okay.
And what is proposed on the lesson is this, no? 1826 lessons that Hegel affirms that the content of our religion and philosophy are the same, but they are different in form, so they are different expressions of the concept.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's a very good question. Well, at least as I understand it, right? The content of art, religion, and philosophy is in fact exactly the same. That is, each of them is trying to provide an explication of what it is to be a geistig, spiritual-minded creature. Here, art does that, religion does that, philosophy does that. This is the basic purpose of why we would be doing art, religion, and philosophy. We are driven to these kinds of reflections on ourselves, and ultimately we're driven to reflecting collectively, not just individually, but collectively on what it is to be the kind of creature that we are here. We're a very peculiar creature. We're the only creature for whom our very existence and being is a problem, as Heidegger would like to put it here. So the content is the same, but the form is different, because the form is going to be, depending on whether it is discursive, partially discursive, or fully discursive, is going to be much different in this. Now, if one thinks, for example, that to be a minded being is fundamentally to stand in a kind of immediate relation to, immediate non-discursive relation, say, to God or the gods or the divine here, then you're going to be ordering these things in a very different kind of way than Hegel did here. And in fact, that's basically one of the ways in which he and Schelling really came to a kind of full disagreement. Schelling always thought for his entire career that ultimately the absolute discloses itself to us in a non-discursive way here. That when we follow all the discursive forms out, they just get all mixed up or they contradict each other, and that in the last analysis, therefore, we have to just have an immediate intuition, an intellectual intuition, as Schelling called it in his earlier years, an intellectual intuition of the absolute. Hegel thought that for various reasons, both logically, but also historically, this had broken down. That is, that the intellectual intuition of the absolute had really revealed itself to be fully empty. He called it the night in which all cows are black. Schelling took that as an insult and never forgave Hegel for it, ever. Here. But that Hegel thought that he had really shown, in fact, in the phenomenology, how the non-intuitive grasp we have of each other in reconciliation and forgiveness, not the non-intuitive, the non-discursive, excuse me, the non-discursive grasp we have of each other in reconciliation and forgiveness, which is essential here. It is the resolution of the problems of mastery and servitude here. That we establish this equality, something I didn't talk about, but I think is also important there. It really establishes not merely the first person singular I and the first person singular plural we, but also establishes the relation of the second person, you and you, right? And that otherwise, until you get to that chapter, you don't have that yet in the phenomenology, at least not explicitly here. So it's really these acts of non-discursive acts of mutual recognition, and seeing ourselves in the other person, seeing the kind of identity and unity and so on that's there that he thinks underlies all this. But that has to give way ultimately to a kind of fully discursive comprehension of what it is to be a spiritual being. And the way it does that is, of course, the story he tells of, in the phenomenology at least, of how the intuitive, non-discursive art religion of Greece breaks down on its own weight, gives way to the partially discursive religion of Christianity, which breaks down as soon as it becomes theology, because it now turns itself over to reason. And once reason is now on its own, subject to a tribunal only of its own making, as Kant would put it, we now have the primacy of philosophy over all this. So the content is the same. The form is different, being whether it's intuitive, representational, or conceptual form, right? Whether it's, again, Anschauung, Vorstellung, or Denken, in this case, that historically and logically we have shown why we are driven to this. And this is also part of now our modern form of life. It's also the case, Hegel thought, that this meant that there can be in our modern constitutional order no aesthetic politics. That any aesthetic attack on the constitution of the state is in fact going to be a reversion to some form of authoritarianism, and so on and so on. So that's the answer to that, at least from how I understand how Hegel's logic and everything all works out. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Bueno, la pregunta refería a la diferencia en las formas en que el arte, la religión y la filosofía son lo mismo, pero tienen forma diferente, ¿no? Y cómo éstas se organizaban en una estructura no teleológica, como se propone o siguiendo las lecciones de 1826. Eso preguntó Bruno. El profesor, para decirlo también, si puedo decir algo al respecto, señala que el arte, la religión y la filosofía son distintas en formas y la diferencia está en su discursividad, ¿no? O sea, el arte sería una forma no discursiva y, bueno, la religión parcialmente discursiva, la filosofía totalmente discursiva, ¿no? Y que tanto lógica como históricamente las formas no discursivas del arte son esenciales en la comprensión, podríamos decir, del absoluto, ¿no? La aprehensión no discursiva es esencial y además el profesor propone que es lo que resuelve el problema del amo y el esclavo, que me parece que es muy interesante de su modo de enfocar el problema, ¿no? Es esta intuición no discursiva lo que finalmente resuelve este problema. Bueno, creo que por ahí va la respuesta. Los que lo escucharon también podrán hacer su interpretación. Eso pude, ¿no es cierto?, captar yo. Professor, do you want another question?
Sure.
Sure? Are you having a good time here with the questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go one more. Fernando Huesca. The reconsideration of the place of modern art after Jena has to do with Hegel's reflection on contemporary politics from 1807 to 1820? It's a question, sorry. The reconsideration of the place of modern art after Jena has to do with Hegel's reflection on contemporary politics from 1807 to 1820s? Did Hegel's contact with Dutch art change something of the structure and contents of his aesthetics? Two questions.
Yes. I think the answer is yes, that in fact it did change the structure of Hegel's aesthetics here, because again, you look at the way it appears in the Phenomenology and then the 1817 encyclopedia, is that there really is no place for modern art. There's a place for religion, Christian religion. There's a place for philosophy, but there's no place for art. Art plays its basic role in ancient Greek life, and then it's over. This is in many ways, if you look at this is in many ways a kind of carryover from his very close friendship with Hölderlin, right, who really thought that in many ways, kind of the Greeks, art peaked with the Greeks, and then the gods went silent, and then now we're just living in the aftermath, this kind of void, waiting for something to happen again, and so on here. Certainly this was an idea that was around at the time, that classical Greece was as good as it ever got in art, and that all art after that is just a pale imitation or failure. However, one of the things in seeing Dutch art that Hegel came to see was that there was a way in which Dutch art established, again, he used two terms, a liveliness a Lebendigkeit, and a Innigkeit, an intimacy with the world. Now, the liveliness is very important here, I think, because Hegel is looking at what role does art have to play in the modern world. Now, the modern world is fundamentally a world that has a large place for it of individual subjectivity, conscience, of looking at our own particular feelings, and so on and so on. And both in the lyric poetry that he sees with people like Schiller and Goethe, but more particularly with Dutch art, right? He sees a way in which the work of art gives us, again, a liveliness, Lebendigkeit, that neither religion nor philosophy can give us. Put it like this, right? If you've just had your heart broken, if your boyfriend or your girlfriend, your husband or wife has just left you today, right? You probably are better off listening to music or reading a poem, maybe read a novel, watch a movie, than reading, say, Hegel's encyclopedia. Right? It's just not going to be much help, Hegel thinks. It's too dry, too distant, and so on. This is one of the reasons why in the 1820s, he also refers, using this metaphor that I've put a lot of emphasis on, to us as amphibians. We now live in two worlds. We live in a kind of rational, reflective, logical world, but we also live in this highly subjective world, right? Focused on individuality and so on. And art steps into that here. One of the features of lyric poetry that makes it so important for modern life is that the lyric poet makes no general judgments. But what the lyric poet says is something like, say Hegel's student Heinrich Heine, the lyric poet says, yes, I had this relationship, it broke up, each of us ended up with somebody else, but we all kind of really think that maybe we should have been together all along. And I know that sounds banal until it happens to you. And that the lyric poet says, this is the way I feel, and it may or may not strike a chord with the rest of us. It gives us a kind of, the lyric poet states a kind of universality for us that is not discursive. It also gives us a sense of also states a kind of universality that's also, but this would take us into a different area. It's also non-quantificational. That is, you can't show that the lyric poet is wrong by coming up with one counterexample here. Nor is it statistical that 96% of people find Goethe's love poetry, say, interesting for themselves. It rather is more like the universal form of the way in which you judge a species of life. If you say that horses have 4 legs, typically, the existence of a 3-legged horse doesn't disprove that. A 3-legged horse is a horse that's having trouble getting around and being a horse. It's a deficient horse and so on, right? So there's lots of ways in which you can talk about the logic of universality that's non-quantificational, but this is one of the things that happens in art. And so Dutch art, because of its liveliness and its sense that it's giving this intimacy with the world, think of Dutch still life here, or think of Dutch genre art here, a man smoking a pipe, or people sitting in a courtyard drinking and laughing and talking to each other and so on. Or the various paintings of Vermeer of people playing a harpsichord or looking out the window, or the astronomer looking at his globe and so on. We get the feeling that we are really letting the world wash over us. It's a sicher gehen in this case. So what I'd say is Dutch art gives liveliness, gives intimacy, and that this is something that is required for us in the modern world. We want to live by universal principles, but we also have these very individual things that are nonetheless have a kind of generality to them. People do get their hearts broken. People do fall in love. People get depressed, so on. And that's what poetry, music, statuary, so on, all that does.
Thank you, professor. Bueno, la pregunta refería a si el arte holandés cambia, digamos, la concepción que tenía Hegel anteriormente sobre el arte, respecto de que solo los griegos habían hecho arte en sentido especulativo, por decirlo así, ¿no? Y nadie más, ¿no? El arte holandés el profesor dice sí, vendría a cambiar las cosas. Cambia la estructura de la estética y el contenido, y el profesor pone énfasis en dos características del arte holandés que son primordiales para Hegel: la vivacidad, si se puede traducir así, ¿cierto? Liveness. Sí. Y la intimidad. Ni la religión ni la filosofía lograrían estas dos notas, ¿no? Discursivamente, ni la intimidad ni la vivacidad. Y esta intimidad y esta vivacidad provienen de la, digamos, de una universalidad no discursiva propia del arte, ¿no? Y de la poesía también. Una universalidad no discursiva, o una universalidad también no sé si la palabra es cuantificable o cuantificante, me parece que es cuantificante. Quantifying or quantifiable?
Quantifiable.
Cuantificable, una universalidad no cuantificable.
Not quantificational.
Ok, not quantification, quantifiable, cuantificable. Que claro, funciona como el ejemplo, pero no es exactamente el ejemplo, ¿no? Como funciona por lo menos en la tradición la figura del ejemplo, ¿no? Sino que tiene este potencial también de universalidad, ¿ya? Y que permite, por lo tanto, una intimidad con el mundo que no había aparecido en otras formas de arte, ¿no? Al parecer. Okay, so how are we, Professor? Do we have more questions? No more questions. They tell me from the society that we're gonna leave it here.
Okay.
Everybody is very thankful. Me too, of course. The society is also, we are very thankful and honored to have you today here. Very interesting talk, very interesting lecture. Well, Fernando says thank you for the answer you just give to him. And well, we're very happy. I don't know if you want to say something else.
Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk with you. And I hope that one day, sometime soon, we'll meet each other in person and not over a screen or something like this. That would be great.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. With more liveliness and intimacy. We shall meet soon, we hope.
Okay, well, I will go and shut this down then. Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bueno, adiós a todos. Muchas gracias por la sintonía. Y bueno, esperen que esta conferencia estará colgada en el YouTube de la sociedad muy pronto. Bye.